has enshrined for generations an ideal of American decency and conduct, and whose author, Harper Lee, President Bush and I were honored to receive at the White House. For me, reading is not just a cause I selected as First Lady. It's one of the guiding passions of my life. So I was especially excited on Saturday, September 8th, 2001. That was the day of the first National Book Festival, an event modeled on the highly successful Texas Book Festival that I helped start a few years earlier when George was governor. It was a thrill for me to bring writers and readers together on that Saturday to the mall in Washington, D.C., in front of one of the most beautiful and meaningful buildings in our capital, the Library of Congress. 30,000 people turned out, wandering from tent to tent on the open mall, listening to readings by their favorite authors, buying books and hearing music. Looking back, that was probably the last weekend when people could participate in a gathering like that, without every now and then nervously glancing over their shoulders or up into the sky. On Tuesday morning, I was looking forward to another of the goals I had set for myself. I was on my way to Capitol Hill from the White House to brief a Senate committee on early childhood education. Just as I was getting into the car, a Secret Service agent leaned over to me and said, "A plane has just hit the World Trade Center." We couldn't imagine the events that would transpire in the coming hour, so I went on with my plans to go to Capitol Hill. I joined Senator Ted Kennedy in his office as the unimaginable news developed. I remember sitting in that office watching the towers fall on television and trying to process what I was seeing as Senator Kennedy, who'd absorbed so many shocks in his own life, kept up a steady stream of small talk. I think he must have been trying to reassure me somehow, but there was no reassuring anybody that day. That night I was taken to a secure location deep below the White House. It's a Spartan place that looks like it was furnished sometime during the Nixon years. It was here that I saw my husband for the first time since this horrible day had begun. I don't remember what we said. I remember that we hugged each other. We were safe. Our daughters were safe. But all we could think about were the thousands of Americans who couldn't say the same about their own loved ones, and about the duty that had suddenly fallen on George to lead our country through the dark shadow that had fallen over it. We slept that night in our bedroom in the White House, though it was a long time before sleep finally came. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps and rapid breathing in the hallway outside. And then a Secret Service agent running into the bedroom, calling out, "Mr. President, you've got to go downstairs." Another plane, he said, was headed toward the White House. I didn't even have time to put on my contacts, so George held my hand as I blindly made my way back down to the bunker in my fuzzy bedroom slippers. But we weren't there long. An aide was unfolding the hide-a-bed when word came that the plane was one of ours. We went back upstairs to bed again, and like all of you, we woke up on September 12th to a different life. As First Lady, I was no longer just speaking out about literacy. I was giving a radio address denouncing the brutal treatment of women and children by the Taliban. I was no longer just organizing book festivals. I was visiting with a class of courageous women police officers in Afghanistan's Bamiyan province, the same province where the Taliban had shocked the world by destroying those two towering 6th century Buddhas. I was with my husband on the days in which he had to make the sort of decisions that every president dreads. I'd originally fallen in love with George in large part because of his sense of humor and his quick wit. I'd wanted to marry someone who could make me laugh. But there were days when there was no laughing and no wisecracks. When I looked at his face and saw the gravity of the choices he had to make. When I saw the tears in his eyes after visiting the parents and spouses of the men and women who'd been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Not everyone had an opportunity to see this side of George W. Bush. For many, he remained a heedless cowboy caricature featured in editorial cartoons, op-eds, and late-night comedy shows. And one of the questions I most often ask is, how did you stand it? Didn't it bother you? Didn't it make your blood boil to read and watch this constant flood of criticism and invective? And of course, it bothered me, just as it would bother anyone in this room. It bothered me, but it didn't get to me. And there are several reasons why. For one thing, I know who I am, and I know who George is. For another, this is America. And America hangs on the proposition that what those of us in the White House sometimes perceive as a chorus of complaint, all that blathering and bloviating, is in reality a kind of sacred music, or at least the clanking gears of democracy. When you live in the White House, you live not just with the ghost of presidents, but with the echoes of citizens holding its government to account. Living there certainly does not make you infallible, but it consistently brings you comfort. Unpopular decisions are made in rooms where other presidents wrestled with their Congresses and their consciences, where their critics denounced them as despots and political hacks. Yet you had the feeling walking through those rooms that they were mostly decent men who tried to do the very best they could with the breathtaking responsibility that had been entrusted to them. I never felt that sense of continuity more strongly than on the morning that George and I left the White House to make way for President and Mrs. Obama. It was a bittersweet day, of course. There were so many White House staffers to say tearful goodbyes to, so many good friends with whom we had spent so much during those 8 years. But as the new president and his wife walked us to Marine One after the inauguration, we felt not sadness, but a solemn pride. As George had said many times, we're the big ship America. We may lean to the left or to the right, but we stay on course. Inside the helicopter waiting for us were my mother and father-in-law. This flight reminded me of a flight I made in 1988 when we were moving back to Texas after living in Washington for a year and a half working on Gampy's campaign. I remembered how on that trip I looked down at the Capitol, the monument shining in the brilliant winter light, thinking how fortunate and privileged I'd been to witness a slice of history firsthand. It would never have occurred to me on that trip in 1988 that 20 years later I would be in Marine One with my husband as he was taking leave of the highest office in the land, sitting next to Gampy and Barr, who had made the same journey following their tenure at the White House, once again leaving D.C. and heading back to Texas. So, after many adventures, we're back home in Texas, living what I call the afterlife, in a state George calls the Promised Land. As I reflect in this afterlife, looking back on the humbling and heady experience of being First Lady at a time when the stakes for my country were so high, one memory keeps surfacing. It's Tuesday, October 30th, 2001, less than 2 months after the terrorist attacks. I'm in Yankee Stadium about to watch my husband throw the first pitch in the first game of the World Series in New York between the Yankees and the Diamondbacks. In any other time, this would be the most lighthearted of presidential duties. But now, every landmark is a potential terrorist objective, every crowd a target. The police officers, firefighters, and other first responders who are guarding the president are still grieving their dead. There are 57,000 people in the crowd. George is under the stadium warming up and talking to Derek Jeter. "Are you going to throw from the mound?" Jeter asks. "What do you think?" George says. "Be a man. Throw from the mound."
I love
Then
it.
as Jeter walks away, he calls out, "Don't bounce it, they'll boo you." George is now worried about bouncing the pitch. But I'm still worried about something else, something I can't bring myself to say aloud. And then he walks out to the pitcher's mound, the only person in the infield, the President of the United States, standing all alone in a crowd at a time when our country is at its most fearful and vulnerable, when an attack from any direction can come in at any moment. All I can do is hold my breath and remind myself that this is the job of the President. But it's not only the President's job, it's the job of any American, Republican, Democrat, or Independent, who has an urge to take a stand and make a difference, and who's willing to step up to his or her own pitcher's mound to face failure, humiliation, or even mortal danger. The greatest honor of being First Lady was having the chance to witness every now and then, not just my husband, but all of America, facing up to fear and shattering change and standing proud. By the way, he threw a strike. At least that's what he told me.